The mahogany-paneled conference room on the 7th floor of the State Department had hosted thousands of diplomatic meetings over the decades, but few with the tension that crackled through the air that Tuesday afternoon. Secretary of State Marco Rubio sat at the head of the polished table, reviewing budget documents with the methodical precision that had defined his political career. The proposed $9.5 billion in foreign aid cuts lay spread before him, cold numbers on spreadsheets that represented a fundamental shift in American priorities. What Rubio didn't expect was the knock on his door at 3:47 p.m., followed by his aide's nervous announcement that Bill Gates was requesting an immediate meeting. No appointment, no advance notice, no diplomatic protocol. Just the world's fourth richest man demanding an audience with America's top diplomat. Gates entered the room with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to having doors opened for him. At 69, he carried himself with the confidence that came from decades of reshaping entire industries, and more recently, entire continents, through his philanthropic empire. His casual button-down shirt and khakis stood in deliberate contrast to the formal atmosphere of government power, a visual reminder that his influence operated beyond traditional political channels. But what Gates didn't realize as he settled into the chair across from Rubio was that he had just walked into a confrontation with someone who had spent his entire political career preparing for exactly this kind of pressure. Someone who understood that the most dangerous adversaries weren't always the ones shouting in congressional hearings, but the ones speaking softly while wielding billions in private foundation money. Before we dive into this extraordinary confrontation that would reshape American foreign policy forever, make sure to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more moments when humanitarian pressure meets political reality. Rubio looked up from his documents, his expression polite but guarded. 23 years in politics had taught him to read power dynamics instantly, and everything about Gates's unscheduled arrival suggested this wasn't going to be a collegial discussion about policy nuances. This was going to be a test of whether America's foreign policy would be dictated by elected officials or by unelected billionaires with global agendas. "Mr. Gates," Rubio said, his voice carrying the measured tone he'd perfected during countless hostile interviews and Senate confrontations. "This is unexpected. I understand you have concerns about our budget proposals." Gates didn't waste time with pleasantries. His foundation had been tracking these cuts for weeks, and every day of delay meant more African lives hanging in the balance. "Secretary Rubio, I'm here because your proposed cuts to USAID and PEPFAR represent nothing short of a humanitarian catastrophe. We're talking about programs that have prevented millions of AIDS deaths across Africa. These aren't abstract policy debates. These are life and death decisions." The directness caught Rubio's staff off guard. Deputy Secretary Sarah Chen, who had been quietly reviewing briefing materials, looked up sharply. Senior Advisor Michael Torres stopped typing mid-sentence on his laptop. Even seasoned diplomats weren't accustomed to private citizens walking into the Secretary's office and immediately challenging core administration policies. The tension in the room was palpable, like electricity before a thunderstorm. But Rubio remained completely composed, the way a veteran boxer stays relaxed when an opponent telegraphs their opening punch. "Mr. Gates, I appreciate your passion for global health initiatives. Your foundation's work has undoubtedly helped many people around the world, but I think we need to have a frank conversation about priorities and responsibilities." Gates leaned forward, his voice taking on the edge that had once intimidated tech executives, and now carried the moral weight of someone who believed he was fighting for millions of lives. "Priorities, Secretary Rubio. PEPFAR alone has saved over 20 million lives since 2003. The programs you're cutting have reduced child mortality rates by 40% in target countries. We're talking about pulling back support that literally keeps children alive." And we're talking about an American government that has a responsibility to American citizens first, Rubio replied, his tone remaining steady but carrying an unmistakable note of steel. Mr. Gates, with all due respect to your philanthropic goals, I wasn't elected to be the world's social worker. I was elected to advance American interests and protect American values. The room fell silent, except for the soft hum of the air conditioning system. Gates blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct pushback to what he considered an obviously moral position. In most of his meetings with government officials, the discussion centered around how much aid to provide, not whether to provide it at all. What Gates couldn't have anticipated was how thoroughly Rubio had prepared for this exact argument. American interests, Gates said, his voice rising slightly. Secretary Rubio, global health security is American security. Pandemic prevention, disease surveillance, building healthcare infrastructure. These programs protect Americans by preventing global health crises from reaching our shores.
Rubio nodded thoughtfully, but his expression suggested he'd heard this argument many times before and remained unconvinced.
That's certainly one perspective, Mr. Gates, but let me share another perspective. One that comes from representing actual American families who are struggling to pay for their own health care while we send billions overseas.
Gates shifted in his chair, sensing that this conversation wasn't following the script he'd anticipated. Usually, when he walked into government offices armed with statistics about lives saved and humanitarian crises averted, officials became defensive, apologetic, or at least engaged in technical discussions about funding levels. Rubio seemed completely immune to the moral pressure that had worked so effectively in previous administrations. Are you suggesting that we should ignore humanitarian crises because of domestic budget concerns? Gates asked, his tone carrying a hint of the moral superiority that had characterized his approach to global philanthropy for decades. Mr. Secretary, we have the resources to address both domestic and international needs. This isn't a zero-sum calculation, isn't it? Rubio replied quietly, and something in his tone made Gates lean forward with sudden attention. Mr. Gates, let me tell you about zero-sum calculations. Last month, I received a letter from a Gold Star mother in Tampa whose son died in Afghanistan. She's been waiting 14 months for disability benefits that might help her keep her house. But we can find $8.3 billion for programs in countries that many Americans couldn't locate on a map. The personal anecdote hit differently than Gates had expected. This wasn't abstract policy debate. Rubio was making this about real American families with real struggles. Gates had anticipated discussions about global health metrics and cost-effectiveness analyses, not stories about grieving mothers facing foreclosure. Around the room, staff members exchanged glances. This wasn't going according to anyone's script. Secretary Rubio, Gates said, trying to regain control of the conversation's moral framework. I understand the emotional appeal of putting America first, but these programs represent our values as a nation. They show the world that America leads, not just through military power, but through humanitarian leadership. Rubio's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. Mr. Gates, let me tell you what shows the world that America leads, taking care of our own people first, making sure that an American veteran doesn't have to choose between buying prescription medication and paying rent, while we fund healthcare programs for people who have never contributed a penny to the American tax base. Gates felt the conversation slipping away from him in a way that rarely happened in his carefully orchestrated meetings with world leaders and government officials. He was accustomed to being the moral authority in the room, the voice of humanitarian reason challenging narrow political interests. But Rubio was flipping that dynamic, positioning himself as the defender of forgotten Americans against global elite priorities. What happened next would devastate Gates's entire approach to government lobbying. You're creating a false choice, Gates insisted, his voice taking on a sharper edge.
America can afford to maintain these programs while also addressing domestic needs. We're talking about less than 1% of the federal budget. The economic benefits of global stability far outweigh these modest investments.
Modest? Rubio repeated, his eyebrows raising slightly. Mr. Gates' $9.5 billion would build 400 new community health centers in underserved American communities. It would fund cancer research that might save American children. It would provide job training for American workers whose industries have been destroyed by globalization. But instead, you want us to prioritize AIDS treatment in countries whose governments spend more on presidential palaces than their own people's health care. The attack was surgical in its precision. Gates had prepared for arguments about humanitarian effectiveness, international relations, and global health security. He hadn't prepared for a fundamental challenge to the premise that American taxpayers should fund global welfare programs while domestic needs went unmet. The atmosphere in the conference room had completely transformed. What began as a standard lobbying meeting had become something else entirely. "Secretary Rubio," Gates said, his voice carrying a note of frustration that his staff had rarely heard in previous diplomatic encounters. "You're oversimplifying incredibly complex global challenges. Disease doesn't respect borders. Economic instability creates refugee crises that affect American interests. These programs aren't charity, they're strategic investments in global stability." "Strategic investments," Rubio repeated slowly, as if tasting the words and finding them bitter. "Mr. Gates, I've heard that phrase used to justify everything from nation building in Iraq to climate programs in China. But you know what I call strategic investments? Investing in American infrastructure so our trucks don't fall through bridges. Investing in American education so our children can compete globally. Investing in American manufacturing so we don't depend on hostile nations for critical supplies." Gates realized with growing alarm that Rubio wasn't just disagreeing with specific funding levels. He was challenging the entire philosophical framework that had guided American foreign aid for decades. This wasn't a negotiation about how much to spend, but a fundamental debate about whether America should be spending this money at all. "You're talking about retreating from American leadership," Gates said, his voice carrying the moral certainty that had characterized his approach to global issues for decades. "These programs have saved millions of lives. Rolling them back would be a moral catastrophe and a strategic blunder that would damage American credibility for generations." Rubio leaned back in his chair, studying Gates with the expression of someone who had just heard an argument he'd been expecting and preparing to counter for months. "Mr. Gates, let me ask you something. When was the last time you visited a VA hospital in rural Alabama? When was the last time you met with families in Ohio whose children are dying from fentanyl overdoses, while we fund drug treatment programs in Guatemala? When was the last time you talked to retired teachers in Florida who can't afford their prescription medications, while we provide free health care to people who've never paid American taxes?" The questions hit like a systematic demolition of Gates's moral authority. Each one highlighted a domestic crisis that competed directly with global priorities. Each one personalized American suffering that was being ignored in favor of international aid. Gates felt the uncomfortable sensation of his humanitarian arguments being turned against him. Deputy Secretary Chen had stopped taking notes entirely, transfixed by the exchange unfolding before her. "Those are important issues," Gates replied, his voice becoming defensive for the first time in the meeting. "But they're not mutually exclusive with global humanitarian programs. America has the resources to address both domestic and international challenges. These cuts represent a false choice, driven by political rhetoric, rather than policy analysis." "Political rhetoric?" Rubio's voice sharpened noticeably. "Mr. Gates, I represent the people who elected me to prioritize their interests. When I have to explain to a constituent why their veteran father is waiting months for medical care, while we fund hospitals in countries that vote against us in the United Nations, that's not political rhetoric. That's political accountability." Gates felt the meeting spiraling completely beyond his control. In most of his interactions with government officials, his combination of moral authority, statistical evidence, and subtle reminders of his foundation's influence had been sufficient to shape policy discussions. But Rubio seemed completely immune to these pressure tactics, almost as if he had been preparing for this exact confrontation. What came next would become the defining moment of the entire exchange. "Secretary Rubio," Gates said,
attempting to reframe the discussion around long-term consequences. These cuts will have devastating effects on global health infrastructure that took decades to build. The programs you're eliminating have prevented pandemics, reduced refugee flows, and created stable markets for American businesses. You're dismantling systems that serve American interests in ways that go far beyond simple humanitarian aid. Rubio nodded, as if he'd expected this argument as well. Mr. Gates, I've read the studies about interconnected global systems and long-term strategic benefits. But I've also read studies about the correlation between domestic investment and economic growth, about the relationship between infrastructure spending and job creation, about the benefits of prioritizing American citizens in American policy decisions. He paused, allowing his words to settle, before delivering what would become the most devastating point of the entire exchange. But more importantly, I've listened to the people who sent me here, and they didn't elect me to be the world's humanitarian coordinator. They elected me to be America's Secretary of State. Those are not the same job. The distinction hit Gates like a physical blow. Throughout his philanthropic career, he had operated on the assumption that humanitarian goals and American interests naturally aligned, that global welfare was simply enlightened American self-interest. Rubio was rejecting that assumption entirely, forcing a choice between global welfare and domestic priorities that Gates had never been forced to make explicitly. "You're talking about abandoning American leadership," Gates said, his voice carrying a note of desperation that surprised even him. "These programs represent American values in action. They show the world that America stands for something beyond narrow self-interest." "Do they?" Rubio asked quietly. "Or do they show the world that America's government cares more about people in other countries than it cares about its own citizens?" Mr. Gates, when American veterans are homeless, while we fund housing programs abroad, what message does that send about American values? Gates opened his mouth to respond, but found himself genuinely struggling for an answer. The moral framework he had relied on for decades, the assumption that humanitarian aid represented obviously superior values, was being systematically dismantled by someone who claimed to represent different but equally valid values. "These programs save lives," Gates said finally, falling back on the statistical arguments that had always carried the day in previous policy discussions. PEPFAR alone has prevented over 20 million AIDS deaths. The maternal health initiatives have reduced child mortality by 40% in target countries. You're talking about abandoning programs with proven track records of success. "Success at what cost?" Rubio replied immediately. "Mr. Gates, those are impressive statistics. But let me share some different statistics. 40,000 American veterans are homeless tonight. 50,000 Americans will die this year from opioid overdoses. 700,000 Americans will declare bankruptcy due to medical bills. These are preventable tragedies happening in our own country, while we fund prevention programs everywhere else." The comparison was devastating in its simplicity. Gates had armed himself with global health statistics that demonstrated the effectiveness of international aid. But Rubio was countering with domestic statistics that highlighted the cost of prioritizing global welfare over American needs. Around the conference table, the silence had become oppressive. Even the building's ventilation system seemed to quiet in anticipation of what would come next. "You're creating false equivalencies," Gates argued, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried at the beginning of the meeting. "American domestic problems require different solutions than global health challenges. These aren't competing programs, they're addressing different categories of issues entirely." Rubio smiled for the first time during the meeting, but it wasn't a friendly expression. "Mr. Gates, They're competing for the same pool of taxpayer money. Every dollar we spend on AIDS treatment in Africa is a dollar we don't spend on cancer research in America. Every dollar we spend on education programs in Asia is a dollar we don't spend on schools in Appalachia. Those aren't false equivalencies. Those are budgetary realities. Gates felt a growing sense of frustration that had become increasingly familiar in his interactions with the new administration. The technocratic arguments that had been persuasive in previous policy environments seemed to carry no weight with officials who prioritized different values entirely. "Secretary Rubio," Gates said, attempting one final appeal to shared humanitarian values. "I understand fiscal constraints and competing priorities, but we're talking about programs that literally keep children alive. How do you justify cutting funding that prevents infant mortality, that stops the spread of deadly diseases, that provides basic health care to the world's most vulnerable populations?" Rubio's response would become the moment that defined not just this meeting, but the fundamental shift in American foreign policy that Gates had failed to anticipate. The room held its collective breath as the Secretary of State delivered what would become the most devastating articulation of America First principles Gates had ever encountered. "Mr. Gates," Rubio said, his voice carrying absolute conviction, "I justify it by remembering that my first responsibility is to American children, American families, American communities. I justify it by prioritizing the veterans who served our country over the citizens of countries that have never served our interests. I justify it by choosing American cancer patients over African AIDS patients, American schools over Asian education programs, American infrastructure over global development projects." He leaned forward, his expression intense but not hostile. "And I justify it because the American people who pay for these programs through their taxes deserve to see those taxes invested in their own welfare before we address the welfare of people who have never contributed to the American system." The room fell completely silent. Gates stared across the table at Rubio, finally understanding that this wasn't a negotiation about funding levels or program effectiveness. This was a fundamental philosophical confrontation between two completely different visions of American responsibility, one global, one domestic. "That's incredibly short-sighted," Gates said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're abandoning decades of humanitarian leadership for narrow political appeal." "No," Rubio replied firmly. "I'm fulfilling the oath I took to defend American interests and serve American citizens. That's not narrow political appeal. That's basic democratic accountability." Gates realized with crystal clarity that he had lost not just this policy battle, but the entire framework through which foreign aid had been discussed for generations. Rubio wasn't defending budget cuts. He was defending a complete reorientation of American priorities that placed domestic welfare explicitly above global humanitarian concerns. "Secretary Rubio," Gates said, making one final attempt to find common ground, "surely we can find a middle path that addresses both domestic needs and international humanitarian obligations. America has always been strong enough to do both." Rubio shook his head slowly, his expression reflecting something that looked almost like pity. "Mr. Gates, that's exactly the kind of thinking that got us into this situation. For decades, American leaders have promised that we could do everything for everyone without making hard choices. The result has been massive debt, domestic neglect, and international programs that often serve the interests of global elites more than American citizens." He stood up from his chair, signaling that the meeting was effectively over. "The hard choice isn't between good and evil, Mr. Gates. It's between America first and America last. I've made that choice, and it's not negotiable.
Gates stood as well, realizing that his unscheduled visit had accomplished exactly the opposite of what he'd intended. Instead of pressuring Rubio to reconsider the cuts, he had given the Secretary of State an opportunity to articulate a comprehensive defense of America First policies that would likely be repeated in congressional hearings and media interviews for months to come. "This conversation isn't over," Gates said quietly as he gathered his materials. "Actually," Rubio replied, extending his hand for a final handshake, "I think it is. But I appreciate you taking the time to understand our position, even if you disagree with it." As Gates left the State Department building that afternoon, he carried with him the uncomfortable realization that the political landscape had shifted in ways his foundation had failed to anticipate. The humanitarian arguments that had guided American foreign policy for decades were being challenged not by isolationists or budget hawks, but by people who claimed to represent a different, but equally legitimate set of moral priorities. The meeting would never be officially acknowledged by either side, but its effects rippled through policy discussions for months afterward. Rubio's articulation of America First principles became a template for defending budget cuts that prioritized domestic spending over international aid. Gates's failed pressure campaign highlighted the limits of philanthropic influence in an administration committed to fundamentally different values. Within weeks, the proposed cuts moved forward exactly as planned. No amount of humanitarian lobbying, statistical evidence, or moral argumentation proved sufficient to overcome the simple political reality that Rubio had articulated. American elected officials were accountable to American voters, not to global humanitarian goals. Gates continued his advocacy work, but with the sobering understanding that the political environment had changed in ways that couldn't be reversed through traditional lobbying tactics. The era of bipartisan consensus on foreign aid had ended, replaced by explicit debates about whether American resources should serve American interests or global humanitarian goals. And in that conference room on the 7th floor of the State Department, Secretary of State Marco Rubio had demonstrated something that would reshape American foreign policy for years to come. The power of putting American citizens first, regardless of the humanitarian costs or global political consequences. It wasn't the outcome Gates had sought, but it was the clarity that American foreign policy had been missing for decades. The choice between global welfare and domestic priorities was no longer hidden behind diplomatic language or technocratic arguments. It was explicit, defended, and politically powerful. America First wasn't just a slogan anymore. It was a governing philosophy, and it had found its most articulate defender in the unlikely setting of a humanitarian lobby meeting that had gone completely wrong. Sometimes, the most important political moments aren't the ones planned in advance, but the ones that happen when competing worldviews collide without warning. Gates had intended to pressure Rubio into maintaining humanitarian aid programs. Instead, he had given Rubio the perfect opportunity to explain why America should prioritize its own citizens above global humanitarian concerns. The humanitarian lobby had met its match in someone who understood that moral authority in American politics comes not from global welfare statistics, but from the consent of American voters. And in that fundamental difference lay the future of American foreign policy: domestic, accountable, and unapologetically American first. If you found this confrontation between global philanthropy and American sovereignty as fascinating as we did, smash that like button and subscribe for more moments when humanitarian pressure meets political reality. What did you think of Rubio's America First defense? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss these incredible political showdowns.